It didn't begin with airports. It didn't begin with aircraft. It began with a nation daring to control the skies above its own head. In the bustling heart of West Africa, on a day that began like any other, the tectonic plates of international aviation were about to shift. The air in Abuja, thick with the promise of rain and the energy of a nation on the move, held no hint of the seismic announcement to come. For decades, the skies above Nigeria, like those over much of the developing world, were a complex tapestry woven with threads of international agreements, historical arrangements, and the pervasive influence of global aviation superpowers. The management of its upper airspace, a critical corridor for trans-African and intercontinental flights, was largely handled through collaborative systems, a legacy of a post-colonial era where technical capacity was often outsourced or shared. But a quiet revolution had been brewing within the corridors of power, a growing sentiment that true sovereignty could not be claimed on the ground if it was surrendered in the air. The nation, an economic and cultural giant, was preparing to stand taller than ever before. Then, it happened. The announcement came not with a whisper, but with the force of a thunderclap. At a hastily convened press conference at the Ministry of Aviation, before a room packed with local and international journalists, the minister stepped to the podium. The mood was electric with anticipation, yet no one was prepared for the magnitude of what was to follow. Flanked by the nation's coat of arms, his expression was one of unshakable resolve. He began, not with pleasantries, but with a declaration that would echo across continents. "Effective immediately," he declared, his voice steady and clear. "The Federal Republic of Nigeria asserts complete and indivisible sovereign control over its entire airspace." A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. He continued, "Every inch of sky, from the lowest altitude to the highest flight level above our sacred land and territorial waters, will henceforth be managed, monitored, and controlled exclusively by Nigerian authorities." The statement was a bombshell. Nigeria's aviation ministry was declaring its intention to seal and control every cubic foot of air above the nation. This was not a policy adjustment. It was a fundamental redefinition of national boundaries, extending them vertically into the heavens. The implications were staggering. No longer would foreign powers or neighboring air traffic regions dictate the terms of passage through Nigerian skies. All international airlines, military aircraft, and private jets would need to seek direct clearance from a newly empowered Nigerian airspace management agency. The old arrangements, some stretching back to the dawn of the jet age, were rendered obsolete in a single sentence. This was a bold assertion of self-determination, a move rooted deep in the nation's history. For a country that fought for its political independence in 1960, this was the next logical and perhaps most audacious step. It was a reclamation of territory, not of land, but of the vast, lucrative, and strategically vital expanse above it. This is far more than an aviation issue. It's a profound geopolitical statement. Nigeria is signaling to the world that it is no longer content to be just a regional leader. It is claiming its place as a global power, one that defines its own terms of engagement. By taking control of its airspace, it's taking control of a major economic artery and a critical piece of global security infrastructure. This move forces every major nation and airline to recalibrate their relationship with Abuja. The technical and logistical challenge, however, is monumental. Asserting sovereignty is one thing, enforcing it is another entirely. It requires a state-of-the-art network of primary and secondary surveillance radars, advanced communication systems, and, most importantly, a highly trained core of air traffic controllers and engineers capable of managing some of the world's busiest air corridors. Critics immediately questioned Nigeria's readiness, pointing to the immense cost and complexity. They warned of potential chaos, safety risks, and the economic fallout from a loss of confidence by international carriers. The global reaction was swift and divided. In the West, aviation authorities and major airlines expressed deep concern, cloaking their economic anxieties in the language of safety standards and operational continuity. Headlines in London and New York questioned the sky-high gamble. But across Africa, the response was different. From Accra to Addis Ababa, Leaders watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Nigeria's declaration was seen by many as a blueprint for the continent, a courageous step towards true African autonomy and a challenge to the neo-colonial structures that still govern the skies. It sparked a continent-wide debate. Was it time for an African sky, managed by Africans, for Africans? But for the Nigerian government, the debate was already settled. This was a matter of principle, a non-negotiable right. The imposing control tower at Abuja was no longer just a building for managing flights. It was a sentinel guarding a new frontier. The animated maps flashing across news screens were not just informational graphics. They were declarations of a new reality. The message, broadcast from the heart of Africa, was unequivocal and clear. Sovereignty begins where the earth meets the heavens. Aviation deals don't measure in millions. They measure in decades of influence, in technological dependence, in the power to control a continent's connectivity. Billions in technology contracts hang in the balance. The stakes have never been higher. Beijing's strategy was methodical, calculated. It was a masterclass in geopolitical patience and precision, born from decades of observing the West's complex and often fraught relationship with the African continent. For years, Nigeria, a titan of Africa, had sought a true partner to help realize its aviation ambitions. Its existing infrastructure was aging, its national carrier had faltered, and its skies were dominated by foreign airlines that repatriated profits without significantly investing in the local ecosystem. Western proposals often came wrapped in red tape, laden with conditions dictated by institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These were deals that felt less like partnerships and more like prescriptions, echoing a past that Africa was determined to leave behind. Beijing saw this opening, this deep-seated desire for respect and autonomy. They moved to offer Nigeria what the West, perhaps structurally, never would: a partnership without the overt sense of patronage. The Chinese proposition was framed in the language of South-South cooperation and win-win outcomes. It was comprehensive. It wasn't just about selling a few dozen aircraft. It was a holistic package, financed by low-interest loans from state-backed institutions like the China Exim Bank, bypassing the stringent, often politically charged conditionalities of Western finance. The offer included the construction of new, state-of-the-art airport terminals, the upgrading of runways and air traffic control systems, and crucially, a fleet of modern Chinese-made commercial jets like the Comac C919 and the ARJ-21 regional jet. Of course, this approach was not without its critics. In Western capitals, whispers of debt-trap diplomacy grew into a roar. Analysts warned that these generous loans were a strategic tool to gain leverage over key assets if Nigeria were to default. But from the perspective of Abuja, this was a calculated risk. The alternative was stagnation, a continued reliance on a system that seemed designed to keep them as consumers, not producers. The promise of tangible development, of gleaming new airports and a national fleet, was a powerful antidote to abstract warnings from the very powers that had historically profited from the continent's resource wealth. But the most seductive element of the deal went far beyond steel and finance. Chinese aviation technology came with promises of knowledge transfer, of building Nigerian capacity from the ground up. This was the core of the pitch for true sovereignty. Beijing didn't just offer to sell planes, they offered to teach Nigeria how to build, maintain, and ultimately innovate within the aviation sector. The plan included establishing joint ventures for MRO facilities right on Nigerian soil. This would end the costly practice of flying aircraft to Europe or the Middle East for major servicing. More profoundly, the agreement laid the groundwork for local assembly plants. The vision was a phased integration, starting with assembling components shipped from China and gradually moving towards manufacturing parts locally. To fuel this industrial ambition, China pledged to fund thousands of scholarships for Nigerian students to study at top-tier institutions in Beijing and Shanghai. Chinese technicians would be deployed to Nigeria not just as supervisors, but as trainers, tasked with cultivating a new generation of Nigerian aviation experts. This stood in stark contrast to the traditional model of Western manufacturers, whose business often relied on protecting proprietary technology and selling lucrative long-term service contracts. For Nigeria, the Chinese offer wasn't just a transaction, it was a blueprint for self-reliance. And for Beijing, this monumental investment had a strategic logic that extended far beyond the bilateral relationship. Nigeria wasn't just another market, it was the gateway to a continent's skies. Positioned at the heart of West Africa, with the continent's largest population and economy, Nigeria was the perfect anchor for China's Air Silk Road. A successful modern aviation hub in Lagos or Abuja, operating with Chinese aircraft and standards, could become the nexus for travel and trade across the entire region. It would create a network effect, encouraging neighboring countries to adopt similar technologies for the sake of interoperability. This would systematically challenge the long-held dominance of European and Middle Eastern carriers on lucrative African routes. A flight from Dakar to Nairobi might one day connect through a Nigerian hub on a Nigerian-operated Chinese-built aircraft. This was about more than just selling tickets. It was about shaping the logistical and economic architecture of a continent, redirecting flows of people, goods, and influence towards the east. In this grand geopolitical chess game, securing Nigeria's aviation sector was akin to capturing the most strategic square on the board. Brussels and Paris scrambled. Decades of assumed dominance over African aviation suddenly faced an existential threat. European aviation giants had treated Africa as a guaranteed market. Now, they faced the unthinkable. Competition for influence they had taken for granted. For Nigeria, airspace control wasn't economics, it was national security. It was the difference between sovereignty and subjugation. Every flight path, every landing permission, every route through Nigerian skies would be decided in Abuja, not London or Paris. The sky above Nigeria belongs to Nigeria. The shadows run deep. Colonial powers had controlled African skies since the first aircraft crossed the continent. British, French, and Dutch airlines carved up African air routes like colonial territories. Independence came to the land, but the skies remained under foreign command. Washington and European capitals watched in alarm as Nigeria signaled its pivot away from traditional aviation partnerships. Markets trembled at the implications. The old order faced a new reality. Africa was no longer asking permission. China offered what Europe never would: genuine technology transfer, financing without colonial conditions, and respect for Nigerian decision-making. Beijing's leverage wasn't just financial. It was philosophical. Partnership, not patronage. Development, not dependence. Nigeria's decision reverberates across the continent. If Africa's largest economy can control its skies, others will follow. The vision extends beyond borders, an African aviation network controlled by Africans. The future of African skies is being written by African hands. For ordinary Nigerians, the message resonated: jobs, pride, and the promise that their nation's future wouldn't be decided in foreign capitals. Aviation schools reported record enrollment. A generation of Nigerians would control their own skies. Nigeria's sealed skies rattled the old order. The telex machines of global aviation authorities chattered with a message that seemed impossible, a digital declaration of independence that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. In London, Paris, and Washington, the news landed not as a policy announcement, but as a direct challenge to the status quo. Emergency sessions were convened in hushed tones, the disbelief palpable. For decades, the skies over Africa were treated as a public utility for the global north. A vast, open highway governed by rules written thousands of miles away, for the benefit of those who had always been in control. This was a system built on a quiet, neo-colonial assumption that African nations, while sovereign on the ground, lacked the technical capacity, the political will, and the sheer audacity to claim the vertical dimension of their territory. This assumed control was a legacy etched in the very fabric of international aviation. Post-colonial agreements, often signed with a profound information asymmetry, had ceded vast swathes of African airspace management to former colonial powers. The Yamoussoukro Decision, a Pan-African pact to liberalize air services, remained a paper tiger, perpetually stalled by external pressures and internal inertia. The continent was a patchwork of inefficient airspaces, forcing intra-African flights into costly and humiliating detours through Europe. Decades of assumed control over African aviation faced an irreversible shift because Nigeria didn't just challenge a rule, it rewrote the entire rulebook. They said Africa could control its land, maybe its waters, but never the skies. This wasn't just a dismissive phrase, it was a deeply ingrained geopolitical doctrine. The land could be partitioned, its resources extracted, the waters could be fished, its coastlines patrolled. But the sky was different. It represented the ultimate high ground, a realm of advanced technology, complex logistics, and global interconnectedness. To control the sky was to control the arteries of modern commerce, diplomacy, and power. It was the final frontier of sovereignty, and the prevailing wisdom was that Africa, a continent still grappling with the legacies of exploitation on the ground, could never hope to master this ethereal domain. The narrative was one of perpetual dependency, for technology, for training, for the very validation of their right to manage their own airspace. The initial response from the West was a predictable storm of condemnation. Veiled threats of economic sanctions were floated in diplomatic backchannels. Op-eds in major Western newspapers decried the move as reckless, a danger to international air safety, and a violation of long-standing agreements. It was the classic playbook: frame an act of self-determination as an act of irresponsible aggression. But this time, the narrative didn't stick. Across the African continent, a different story was unfolding. Initially, there was a cautious silence from other African capitals, a collective holding of breath. But as days turned into weeks, and Nigeria's new system held firm, demonstrating competence and control, that silence turned into a murmur of admiration, then a chorus of support. The African Union, often criticized for its inaction, issued a landmark statement endorsing Nigeria's sovereign right. One by one, other nations began reviewing their own airspace agreements, inspired by the audacity of their West African neighbor. A new Pan-African consciousness was taking flight, fueled by the realization that what was once deemed impossible was now a tangible reality. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a meticulously planned and executed strategy, years in the making. The backbone of this new sovereignty was the TRACON project. A massive, technological undertaking, it replaced outdated, patchy systems with a state-of-the-art network, giving Nigerian air traffic controllers a god's-eye view of every inch of their airspace for the first time. This technological leap was the definitive answer to the condescending whispers about African incapacity. It proved that the continent could not only adopt, but master the complex systems required for modern aviation management. The economic dividends were immediate and transformative. Overflight fees, once collected by foreign agencies, now flowed directly into Nigeria's treasury, funding further development. Lagos and Abuja began to emerge as genuine international hubs, not just transit points. The new, efficient national flight paths streamlined air travel, reducing fuel costs and flight times, and fostering the very intra-African connectivity that the old system had so effectively suppressed. A flight from Accra to Addis Ababa no longer needed a European layover. The arteries of African commerce were finally being rerouted to serve Africa itself. The old colonial powers had drawn lines on the map of Africa, dividing peoples and plundering resources. Their descendants had drawn invisible lines in the sky, perpetuating a system of economic and psychological control. They believed this final domain was theirs forever, but they misjudged the enduring spirit of a continent. They underestimated the resolve of a nation determined to be the master of its own destiny, from the soil beneath its feet to the boundless heavens above. Today, Nigeria has answered, with radar systems, with new policies, with unwavering resolve. The answer echoes from the Sahel to the Cape, a powerful, undeniable truth. The skies belong to Africa. This Insight Africa, where sovereignty takes